Well, hello, everyone. Today we have a neuroscientist on the show. I'm very pleased to have Matthew Betts with me today, who is a neuroscientist. Part-time, he is a principal investigator at Otto von Guericke University Magdeburg. I hope I pronounced that right. He did his Ph.D. work at King's College in London, and that was followed by a postdoctoral research at the German Center for Neurodegenerative Diseases. That's a very cool place, actually. I remember that place. I almost went there. So he's been in academic research for over 17 years and published over 40 peer-reviewed studies, mostly focusing on aging and neurodegenerative diseases. He's also building a strong community on LinkedIn, and he's mentoring PhD students navigate through their early careers. Matthew, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Ken. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure having you on. It's finally we're gathering neuroscientists. That's great. Matthew, tell me more about your background. How did you come to do neuroscience in London, and then continuing the academic path and ending up?
Yeah, well, that's quite a journey, really. It's quite funny. So it really all starts in a small village in southwest Wales. So I'm originally from the UK, and I'm not from a family of scientists at all. So my parents have a background in agriculture. My sister's very much more involved in the arts and music. And I think just from an early age, in school, my favorite topic was biology. I've always, I think, been fascinated by physiology, understanding, how organisms really function. That really sort of also came to a head with a very sort of, personal experience in our family when my grandmother developed dementia. And that was obviously quite, a very intense experience. She lived very close to us, and we got to see, just how she changed during that time, and how really the disease sort of robbed her of her life in a sense. But also, there was that kind of fascination about what's really happening, there in the brain. And I think that was quite a turning point to really sort of want to pursue that further. And I think initially my interest came from more the treatment side, which was how I became interested in pharmacology. So that's actually what I studied. Then I moved away from home and studied pharmacology in Bristol University in England. And then I really sort of pursued that passion further to then do a PhD in neuropharmacology. And then for the last sort of 14 or so years now, I've been working in the field of neuroscience.
That's awesome. I mean, it's the motivation to enter science sometimes is a painful one, but it's something that drives you and that can develop that passion further. Tell me, maybe I just want to go a little bit into the field of neuroscience itself, and in particular the state of research when it comes to all these different dementias. Could you tell me, I mean, I know we get new drugs every now and then for Alzheimer's and different kinds of dementia. They don't seem to be working. Are there any exciting discoveries in the recent years that you can pinpoint and say, actually, that might be a way to solve at least a little piece of this puzzle that is dementia?
Yes, yeah. I mean, that is a very interesting, time now for Alzheimer's research, because I think for a long time we've had to, focus on these drugs that target the symptoms of the disease with kind of limited efficacy, but don't really address the underlying, pathology of the disease and the progression of the disease. And so now there are drugs that are coming, with the aim to really try to really slow down the progression of the disease. And so particularly targeting, amyloids, this pathological protein that aggregates in the brain. And so now there are a class of these drugs that are going through clinical trials. Now some that have been successful in clinical trials and actually have been FDA approved. So these are actually coming now to the market. And those trials, they've created a huge amount of discussion. Of course, they've technically been effective, but the whole discussion is about how effective they really are and whether the clinical benefits that have been seen in those trials will actually translate to having any benefit to the quality of life of those people, with Alzheimer's disease dementia.
Sorry to jump in there. So when you say that these drugs are effective, that means they're effective at what they're supposed to be doing, which is in some way maybe lowering the amount of amyloids, but clinically the patient himself will maybe not experience a return of memory or recovery or the delay of progression of disease. That's the main discussion.
Well, yeah. So they have also shown clinical benefits in that it can have slow down the cognitive dysfunction. So it was over a period of 18 months, these clinical trials. The actual, it was a statistically significant effect, but, the effect was small. And, you're doing this using clinical tests. And the question is whether a few benefits, a few points that, have that you've seen clinical efficacy of these trials will actually translate to, actually aiding quality of life for these people. And so what's not, which is very clear, is that these drugs work. So, in terms of the hypothesis and reducing amyloid, they're very effective for that. But it's more, I think, that whether the hypothesis is right, that reducing amyloid will actually have, clinically meaningful benefits to the individual themselves.
Recently I was on a conference, which was not a scientific conference, but more of a little business people, little scientists, little inspiring influencers. So all sorts of people, they were giving presentation, and there was this one particular MD scientist who is in the field of Alzheimer's, and he gave a talk for about 15 minutes talking about all these new methods to measure or your amyloids. We can predict if they're going up. We can predict maybe if you'll get the Alzheimer's in 10, 15 years. We can scan your brain. We can take your blood and measure amyloids from blood, all of that. So it made me believe maybe we are making some progress here. And then later I spoke to him during the dinner I approached him while he was munching his food. And I asked him, I know there's some debate about amyloid. People have different hypotheses. We try to lower amyloids. It's not really doing much. So I asked him, do you think these amyloids and tau, these are the main causative agents of disease? And just out of from the sky, he said, no, I don't think they're actually causative. I think they are the good guy. And the underlying process is something bad, and they are aggregating as a consequence. And I'm not sure, how to target the disease. So I asked him, so what do you think is the cause? He said, well, I am a bit on the fringe. I think it's a virus.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering just how much are we, how much is this community of neuroscientists in this field discussing alternative hypotheses? Is it that we are really stuck with amyloids and tau and we're going to be targeting that for another 100 years? We'll be right back to the podcast, but first I want to say thank you to our sponsor, Litmaps. If you are struggling with the academic literature and you are overwhelmed by the number of papers you are trying to read and make sense out of it, Litmaps is here to help. And visualize for literature, you can find research gaps, and you can create a beautiful map and keep yourself updated every time a new paper comes out that is connected to the map you've built. And if you're working on a review paper with other collaborators, this map that you build, you can also share with your collaborators and have them build it so that you can go back and forth in exploring the important papers of your field. Litmaps is a fantastic tool that I've been using for over 6 months now, and I've found it incredibly useful for many purposes, and it's completely free to use. If, however, you want to use the more powerful Pro version, you can use the code in the description, Canon30, and you'll get 30% off on all of your first-time purchases with Litmaps. Thank you, and let's get back to the episode.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that's really exactly where the field is really probing, to really find answers for at the moment. But I think we're at a sort of turning point. So now there's obviously a lot of interest from these, positive clinical trials to develop now a lot of anti-amyloid drugs. So you can imagine, all pharmaceutical companies will jump in on this. and develop their own drugs. But it still remains to be determined, how effective they will really be. And, you also have to take into consideration the number of clinical trials that, weren't effective prior to these ones. And you can, I think, have good justifications for, everything is an evolution. You learn a lot from these clinical trials, and these clinical trials are massive effort to implement. But I think there are a lot of things that being looked at for Alzheimer's. It's also things that you can do yourself. So, in terms of looking after yourself, in terms of identifying risk factors, typically a lot of the focus is on really minimizing actually the initiation disease. So if you can actually prolong, the time before you actually get Alzheimer's disease, I think we know that there are things that we can do there. So we know that diabetes, we know that hearing loss, we know that poor diet, if we don't look after ourselves in terms of physical exercise, obesity, lack of education, these are all potentially contributing to having higher risk of developing something at some point. So they are things that we can do. When it comes to treatments, there are other things. So, for example, looking at neuroinflammation, there are also even drugs that are potentially out there that can be repurposed to actually address also some of the symptoms, because they are also quite limited in their efficacy at the moment. But a lot is riding on amyloid and tau. And I think if these really, don't come to fruition, there will be a bit of a lull in terms of what comes next, because there's huge effort going into that. The compounds now are being developed for amyloid, but the tau is a bit, still further upstream. But these results will be coming from clinical trials soon.
And in your academic career so far, how would you summarize which part have you mostly focused on? What approach have you taken in your research?
Yeah, so we're not directly involved in treatments per se. So we're actually trying to understand, the early phases of disease. So what happens? We know that also tau, accumulates as a result of normal aging. But, what occurs in the brain for someone to, age normally versus then someone that actually starts to develop, Alzheimer's dementia. And my interest has always been, also with a pharmacology background, to look at the neuromodulatory, circuits in the brain. So I've done a lot of work looking at dopamine, so particularly in aging, Parkinson's disease, but in more recent years, the focus has been on noradrenaline, and really looking at the kind of one of the key nuclei in the brain that, synthesize noradrenaline, the locus coeruleus. And this is a very small region in the brainstem. And it's quite a fascinating nucleus because it's involved in the regulation of arousal, attention, and neurocognitive processes, when it's only sort of 30 to 40,000 cells. So it's a tiny nucleus, and post-mortem studies have shown that you can see tau in this region very early on as a result of normal aging, and is potentially also involved in the pathogenesis of Alzheimer's. So, coming from then this interest also in neuroimaging, a lot of our focus has been on trying to image this structure and really understand what's going on in aging, and also then in individuals that are potentially on a trajectory towards developing Alzheimer's dementia. And so that involves doing a lot of MRI imaging, but also then combining that with other forms of imaging like PET imaging, where we then not only look at the locus coeruleus, which is mainly from a structural point of view, but also try to understand function. So that's when we like to look at these PET ligands, where you can look at maybe the metabolism to certain regions that the locus coeruleus attracts to, or maybe also look at the transporters in the brain. And these, with every measure that we have, we get a bit more information in terms of what's going on.
So you mentioned that this little nucleus that is a tiny number of cells is regulating a lot of things that to me sounds like it's regulating all of the things that are everyday kind of things that we do. So when you say arousal, I'm thinking immediately sleep. I'm thinking, the way you behave, the way you ingest food, because food is modulating how you sleep as well. and all of that. These everyday things you say we can do, let's say if we wanted to prolong our life without getting any or developing any of these neurodegenerative diseases, what would be the number one thing? Is it sleep? Is it diet? Is it altogether a little bit? Is there the biggest risk factor?
I think it's really a cumulative thing. So, as many boxes that you can tick, the better. So for sure, good night's sleep is critical. So particularly in the case of the neurogenetic system, actually that's not so active during sleep. But what we do know from diseases like Parkinson's disease, that there's something going on there where then the locus coeruleus is actually active and is causing sleep disruption. And we know that sleep disruption is also problematic in a number of diseases, also in Alzheimer's disease, and is potentially an early indicator of something not being right. So, there can be other factors, but, it's a potential flag that, you want to look at. So, yeah, sleep is definitely a critical one. Also, exercise. We know that exercise is fantastic for the brain. It's increasing blood flow. We're trying to stimulate the brain. We know that, learning a language or anything like that, something that's very cognitive demanding, is important, for maintaining cognitive function. That it's, in a sense, it's like, using any other muscle in your body. We need to stay active, and the longer we can do that, the better.
Has there been any studies that actually focused on delaying the progress by using these kinds of cognitive exercises? Let's say if we get a group of people who are early onset Alzheimer's, we kind of caught it, we see it's going to develop, and we try to give them, learn a new language or put them on an exercise regime or something like that. Has there been studies like that?
They have, yeah. It's interesting. So there are, I think, studies that have looked at language would have found some benefits. More, I think, looking at younger adults. So I'm aware of some studies at the Max Planck Institute here in Germany that have looked at this. When you specifically look at cognitive training, the idea that you can play these games and this is good for your brain, this is a lot murkier, I think, in terms of what's coming up. And I think the problem there is that, you typically train on, say, maybe it's like an attention game or something. And for sure, you get better at that game. But, a lot of the time, that's really like a training effect. And what is typically then missing is that the benefits that you see from doing that game, they don't seem to translate in terms of, any other cognitive process that you would perform. So there's something going on where you may see small benefits, if you do another kind of attentional task or something like that, but they actually poorly generalize to, say, improving memory or maybe, some other cognitive function. So they've actually had quite limited utility. And exercise is another interesting. So you see that there are benefits from, say, mild to moderate exercise, sometimes not so much in extreme exercise, or it can get quite complicated in terms of also what intervention to do, so what type of exercise. But it's a very active area of research, and I think it's generally clear that by exercising and engaging your brain, that this is ultimately beneficial. It's just more of a question of what is really optimal and what exercises you should be doing.
All right, I think I have reached my pinnacle of the podcast, because now we are another podcast here that is just telling people to sleep and exercise. So great for us.
Yeah,
that's great. Take me back to your PhD experience. How was that for you? How were your early science beginnings? What did you struggle with? What did you dream about?
Yeah. Generally, I think I was very fortunate. So I had a fantastic time during my PhD. But I think that was mainly due to already working for a year in industry doing my undergrad. So when I studied pharmacology in Bristol, there was this option to do a year in industry. And I got to work at Eli Lilly, a pharmaceutical company, for a year, my third year. And people say things are life changing quite freely these days, but I can honestly say this year was life changing to me, because it really totally transformed me as a person. After 2 years of doing pharmacology, I think I enjoyed the theory, but practical was always very difficult. I didn't really get what was going on. We did a lot of experiments using bits of guinea pig ileum tissue, and we were doing basic receptor kind of interaction stuff. So like, what happens when you inject an agonist on this tissue? Contracts. What happens when you add an antagonist, etc. And usually, something would go wrong, and it became a bit of a joke that, at the end we would just get the model data, and then, we'd all go to the pub or something. And I sort of felt a bit demoralized by it, honestly, and didn't really feel that I, had developed really any skills practically up until that point. And then it's like there was an opportunity to apply to become a placement student at Eli Lilly. And, then it was really throwing yourself into the deep end. So I just remember seeing the initial description of the project, which, it was a preclinical project. So it involved working with a technique called microdialysis. And I didn't even really understand what that was. And sort of my preparation for the interview had also been pretty dodgy. And that, I'd more tried to understand the portfolio of drugs that Eli Lilly was working on. And you didn't really know kind of what project you'd potentially be working on. So it was also really just going, a bit into the unknown. But anyway, I think just from literally starting from not having a clue what you're doing, and then through that year, developing competence and also confidence to work, independently was a complete game changer. So I distinctly, remember needing support with everything in the beginning, but really at the end of that 12 months, I could do everything on my own, and, ended up staying for another couple of months to do a separate little side project. And that for me also made me realize that, if I was serious about going further down the research line, then I would need to get a PhD. Up until that point, that hadn't really been on my agenda, to be honest. And I hadn't really thought about what I'm going to do. And so from that then year, it was like, okay, well, who is working on this area? This area is completely, blown my mind, really. I'm just really fascinated by it. And from that experience, then got to also understand labs in London that were working on very similar topics, and that had then prepared me to go there. So in that sense, it wasn't such a huge jump to go straight then into my PhD. And, I guess there are also other ways that you could do that through, say, developing, going on a master's program. But, I'd already, once I was starting my PhD, I could really get going from really the beginning. It was quite clear what I needed to do. And, then it was just a case of sort of adapting to that environment and understanding, how to set up the experiments and stuff.
Was there any particular area of your life that you struggled with when it comes to your PhD, such as organization, staying on top of all the experiments, productivity, which word or angle you want to approach this with? What did you struggle with most?
I think knowing when, to leave it. That, to be honest, is still a struggle. But, I think during a PhD, you get a first indicator of what it's like, in sort of trying to have a balance between work and non-work related activities. And that's the first, time for me where I really had to think about, developing boundaries. Because if you allow it, the work will just take over. There will always be work to do. And in the beginning, I think you have that perception that if you just keep working, you'll get to a point where you'll be finished. And that's kind of a bit of an illusion, because obviously, in research, you will never be finished. And you have to put then things in place to say that, I'm not working this weekend, or I really want to do this thing at the lab. your environment is also really important with that. I was very fortunate that my supervisor was there when I needed her and, asked for her input and support, but then she would also give me the rein to then, work on my own, and appreciated, when I would want to take holiday and things like this, and was not, challenging me to work out of hours. So I think from that point of view, yeah, I was lucky, but for sure there were a number of challenges that came up, through that period. Another one is feedback. So I've always struggled with that a bit. When you experience rejection for the first time, for example, when it comes to publishing your work, you have to also learn how to deal with that. In the beginning, it can feel that it's very personal, but I think with time and the more you do it, you realize that this is just a necessary part of the process, and you can also, again, create boundaries for that, where you may initially have a very emotional reaction to some of the feedback you get, but as long as you take your time to not act when those emotions are high, and always reread those things again, most often or not, you'll see that there is a benefit to what they're saying there, and your work can be improved as a result of it. But that's also like a learning process. That's taken a lot of flying for things and rejections and reformatting, restructuring work, to really be kind of content with that just being a necessary part and parcel of the process.
Does it ever get personal in peer reviews that the peer reviewer is being a little like, because it's single blinded. They know your name, they know you are
Yeah,
submitted and your lab is submitting, but
yeah.
you don't know who is reviewing you. So if you are their competitor, I can imagine a situation where somebody might be like trashing a paper a little more than necessary. Does that ever?
It does happen. Not so often, at least in my experience, fortunately. But you will get someone, and you also don't know what's going on with them, right? Maybe they had a bad day when they were writing that. And most often than not, that person doesn't know you personally. So again, it's not personal. And I think the important thing in that situation is to focus on what you can control. And I think, sometimes you will react to it, the famous reviewer too. You'll see something, you'll be like, how on earth have they, not got this or something? And you're just like, this is insane. And the trick for me is to always leave, with critical feedback like that at least 24 hours before acting on it. So even now, when we get feedback from a paper, one of the students will circulate feedback, we go through it, and if there's stuff in there that we have to really think about, it's like, okay, that's what that's how it is. Let's leave it 24 hours, read it again when things are a bit calmer. It's like, okay, again, a very familiar thing is often it's not as bad as you initially make out. When you're in this kind of fight or flight reaction, you're seeing everything is very critical. Once you're calmer, you actually see that actually it's not maybe as critical as you initially thought it was. And then, you're much more then proactive. It's like, okay, let's start thinking about how we can address these points. And the point is, if somebody is rude as well, there's nothing you can do about it. The only thing that you can do is control your response to that. Ultimately, you want to try and get your work published. So, respond with politeness. And that doesn't mean that you have to agree with everything, by the way, that they're suggesting. Sometimes if you've got evidence that support, your arguments, then you should definitely, communicate that in your rebuttal. And it's important to then, otherwise it can also sometimes completely change the focus or the intention of the piece of work.
One thing I recently noticed in some journals, and it actually completely changed the way I read papers. Some of the journals have incorporated the transparent open peer review. So in some of the Nature papers, you can see a peer review file. So you can actually see what peer reviewers have said and what the authors have responded and the decision of the editor. I think eLife does the same thing. I'm not sure if any other journals do it. But it's always revealing. You take I first look at the peer review now. The peer review file if it's available, and you see that sometimes the reviewer was maybe harsh, but it was actually because they didn't read carefully enough. And then the authors say, hey, actually, you missed it. We actually showed the thing you're asking right down below figure 7C in the supplement.
Yeah.
And then like, oh, okay, that addressed my my concern. So you can see kind of the behind the scene. I think that's very nice, because peer reviewers are also not paid to peer review, so it's not always perfect. That's something important to know.
That's true. I think it's also a good thing, to publish all the review process. I think in that sense, it's good for the reviewers as well, because there's also a bit of accountability. Their responses are also being published. I think that also means that, they have to definitely think, a bit more in terms of how they're responding to authors and things. And it's, as you say, you learn a lot from reading those exchanges, and also how reviewers think. I think that's also very useful, particularly in the beginning, where you're you're new to the whole publishing process.
So Matthew, you did your postdoc at the German Center for Neurodegenerative Diseases. When did you start planning to do a postdoc and thinking about where to apply, and how did you organize that whole process? Right now I'm thinking already, I'm in my first year of PhD, and I'm thinking already, hey, actually 4 years of a PhD is not a lot. It might be good to start planning already, so because first year is already almost gone, and then fourth year is probably going to be just publishing and trying to figure out the thesis. So I have just second and third left. I might planning right away. So tell me about, how did you go through that process?
I think I started initially looking halfway through my PhD, and then became much more then active within the last year of the PhD. And I think in terms of how much, preparation, things that you want to put into that also really depends a bit on what you want to do. So for me at that point, I wanted to definitely, actually I had two options. At the end of my PhD, or halfway through my PhD, I sort of realized that as much as I enjoyed what I was doing, I wanted to do more clinical research. And so initially, I thought this meant that I would need to do medicine. So I looked into medical courses initially, but then I'd also realized, that you could do that within a research context, but, by still as a neuroscientist, and say, for example, working with human imaging or something like this. So in my case, it was still more straightforward, because really I was just juggling those two options. I think, if you're considering maybe then transitioning from academia or something like that, I think maybe that can take longer, because you might not necessarily know what you want to do, and then that's quite a then exploration and kind of journey to really narrow that down, and really spend time to think about what you want. I think it's also, once you get more towards the end, you're starting to get a bit stressed about finishing the PhD, and you're writing your thesis and everything. When you also have in the back of your mind that you're not sure that you want to stay in research, but you still don't really know what else is out there if you don't do that, then it can all get a bit stressful. And so you can avoid that, I think, by listening, to those thoughts that are going on. If you're thinking something is not right and you want to pursue that, then I would really recommend trying to allocate some time during your PhD to explore that curiosity. Because the longer you leave it, then the more you'll feel that you just have to make a decision. And the kind of easier option there is to carry on, right? So to maybe do a postdoc that's very similar to your research, but that's not necessarily what you want to do. So you definitely, I think, have to take some time to really think about, your options.
You run something that is called Matthew's office hours.
Yeah.
where I understand you're mentoring young scientists. What do young scientists mostly need mentoring with?
So yeah, it's interesting. So I've been running this for about 3 to 4 months, which is really, just saying, here I am. If you'd like to talk about something, regardless of where you are on your journey in academia, shoot me up basically. And a lot of those conversations have been master students reaching out and being curious about doing a PhD. And they would like to find out more about what it actually means to do a PhD, and also specifically about how they can present themselves to be eligible for a PhD, and also, to prepare their application for PhDs. But yeah, I've had many calls from prospective students, but then there's also been from postdocs. So postdocs, maybe the multiple postdocs, and they're really thinking about whether academia is right for them, whether they actually have a future in academia, and then if not, what to do. And that can also be quite a tricky situation to be in, because it can vary. Sometimes those people want to stay, but they feel that they have limited opportunities to continue down the academic route, or then others feel that they have to transition because it's been clear to them that they can't continue in their current position, but they don't know what else to do. And so those conversations usually involve trying to break down this sort of feeling of being lost and identifying, what they can see themselves doing beyond academia. And often they still have interest in research, but they haven't necessarily, they can't see themselves in another environment where they would be working on similar projects and using similar skills.
So there's two groups of people you mentioned there. One is more early career master students, and then there's people who are finishing their PhD, doing a postdoc, and thinking about maybe landing a professorship somewhere. Let's focus first on this first group of people, like the master students. I get a lot of inquiries as well about, is PhD even for me? Is that something I should pursue? I hear a lot of good things. I hear a lot of bad things. I hear a lot of horror stories from some people, but some people have a fulfilling experience. So what do you say to someone who asks you, is this for me? How should I know if this is the right path for me?
Yeah. Well, I usually try to answer that question with a question to them. And I think a lot of the advice that I give mainly comes down to really trying to get them to ask themselves certain questions. Because, I can give my perspective in terms of what a PhD was like for me, but that may have actually no significance for their current situation. The question is, why are you currently considering a PhD? What do you expect to get out of a PhD, and what are your interests? So what do you actually want to do for a PhD? And just by asking those questions, I think you immediately get an idea of where they're at with their thought process. Some of them have thought about a PhD, but it sounds like it hasn't gone much beyond that. That PhD is kind of this next step, but they're kind of unclear about, where they would even start with that. What you do for a PhD, what your kind of interests are. But then for the others, it's like, well, I know that I have this interest, but I haven't thought beyond the PhD. And I know that that is also quite difficult, right, at the master's level. But ultimately, the PhD is not the end. It's actually really the prerequisite for starting a career in research. At least, that's really for technical definition of getting a PhD, is to actually become, a capable, independent researcher. So the broader question is, do you actually see yourself being in research, beyond the PhD? And then the other question is, do you need a PhD, for what you want to do? And so then it's really finding out about, what they are interested in doing. Of course, those things may change, during PhD process, but I think it's important to, have already started thinking about these things, because, once you then get into the PhD, you can be very much wrapped up in the day-to-day things, but you're not necessarily then sure, what you're going to do after the PhD. So, they're really the kind of main questions I get to ask them, and really whether, this is coming from them as well. I think in many cases, somebody has, maybe told them that they should do a PhD. I quite often hear, the PhD will help me, it will improve my life in some way. And, I get to challenge them a bit with that. I said, well, it might, but it also really depends on what you're going to do at the end with the PhD. So, how much have you thought about that? What professions, when you'd actually need a PhD, and also how this relates, to their interests.
You've mentioned that you were quite fortunate to have really nice supervisors who gave you great advice and insights, and both on the high level and as well as the experimental level as well. Some people are not fortunate. They choose wrong, or they get handed a bad deal. So I think it's quite important to try to invest some effort into finding the right people to work with. How would you go about, let's say I'm a master's student. I know I want to do neurodegeneration for my PhD, and there's 45 labs that do something that they are my filtered list of labs. But, I now want to find out of those 45 people, which ones are the most conducive to a successful career and my thriving as a scientist and so on. How would you go about that? Finding the right professor to work with and narrowing it down to the right.
Yeah. I mean, if you're, new to that area, I guess a lot of that is coming from what you search for, on the internet. More likely or not, you're going to come across big names within the field. And that will probably be your starting point. And then you'll look at what they're doing research-wise. So I think the really important thing is to look at really the research that they're doing in the lab. So it's not necessarily about, identifying prestigious universities. It's really about what that lab in particular is doing and whether that lab really interests you. Now, you can go to, labs with famous PIs and you can have probably a fantastic experience. But you also want to know what environment, you're going into. And I think that involves doing some research and going beyond also then just looking at the research. So once you've identified potential labs where you think, I can really see myself there, I'm really fascinated by their research, then, by all means reach out to the PI, but then also speak to, people within the lab. So check out the lab page and see who's working there. That's particularly important if you're getting to an interview stage. So before, you accept, ask if you can speak to people within the lab. That's not an unusual thing to ask for at all. So people can then firsthand tell you what it's like working with them. Also, try to speak to some alumni as well. In some cases, those already working in the lab, maybe you might think that they can't speak entirely freely. So go another step and then speak to alumni that have been and gone, and they have no further connection there, and ask them about their experience. Working with that PI, someone that they would recommend. How was it also working with them? What did they expect from you? Did they respect your boundaries? Things like this. And I think you can really learn a lot from speaking to current and past members of the lab, because otherwise it's very high risk decision, on both sides, to be honest. So you probably have one or two interviews, and then a decision is made, and you agree to work together in quite an often intense relationship for 4+ years. So it's really important that you try your best to get that right.
What is one or two things PhD students, so people who are already doing a PhD, are not doing, but they should be doing if they want to one day become a professor? That would something that would benefit them the most.
Wow, that's a good question. It's very difficult when you say professor, because I think there's not one route, to getting there. And I think there are probably some things that can help you stand out. But I think also then understanding, your environment is an important one. So, for example, how one would advance their career, say, here in Germany, may be different to, say, the US or the UK, or maybe even be institution specific. So actually understanding how this works in your institution is important. So first of all, is there even an opportunity to progress? That needs to be clear, and that's not always straightforward to understand. So if you always speak to your supervisor, sometimes the supervisor will be very clear with you, from day one, that you can do your PhD here, but I don't have any more funding to, keep you on beyond that. So, it's clear. Others, it may be more of a gray zone. And honestly, if you're also very good, they may try to keep you. And in some cases, they may not be entirely transparent about, the opportunities available. So it's really important that you understand that. And so then also go beyond your PI, speak to, it's always helpful to have a mentor, so someone that, you can speak to outside of your, student or postdoc PI relationship, as they can give you neutral advice. But then for progressing, career, I think you also want to speak to people within your faculty as well. So you have to be very proactive in that sense about, defining a path and identifying whether a path is actually open to you at your institution. And generally, I think having a sort of mindset where you need to really devote some time in terms of sharing your work. So, and knocking on doors. So this is something that, I've been guilty of in the past, and also I see it in a lot of other students and postdocs, that the focus is on developing, their technical expertise, and this kind of perception that, your work will speak for itself. So as long as I, become really good at what I'm doing, I publish, it's very clear that, I'm good. I have my, publications to show you what I can do, but it's just not as straightforward as that. And, you need to still go the extra mile. It's very competitive once you go beyond the postdoc phase to actually try to carve out a career in academia. And I think it's not one size fits all, but I think generally speaking, the ones that go further ahead spend more time in thinking about these additional aspects in addition, to really their research. And sometimes that can involve being a bit political to understand, whether you really have opportunities there, whether you can also, draw in support from other people to help generate opportunities, and really not being afraid to ask for what you want. I think that's actually really key. So a lot of the time, people don't actually say explicitly that I want to progress my career here. Is this happening? I think a lot of those conversations go that, I want to progress, but then there aren't kind of clear milestones towards achieving that. And so you can sometimes then enter this kind of gray zone where you keep doing more work, but this doesn't necessarily translate into, hitting the next step towards advancing your career.
You said, even with work speaking for itself as much as it can, it might not speak loudly, but it speaks a little bit. You said you still have to go the extra mile, and you mentioned you still have to talk to people and try to make your desires known, I guess. If you want to progress in a certain direction, try to talk to people directly about that and be explicit about it. What else do you mean by going the extra mile? Is it mostly about, networking and trying to understand the whole landscape of opportunities, or is there anything else in there?
Yeah. Do you know Vin Yang, the communications coach?
I do. I did not know that's how you pronounce his name.
I'm not sure I've got that right, actually.
Okay. So, but
It may be
it's
different.
it's a guy with very suggestive, very beautiful body language and clear
Yeah.
speaking. Yeah, I know him.
Yeah.
He's great.
Yeah.
I don't know him personally.
I joined. I didn't know, but I had joined one of his masterclasses a couple of months ago, and he had this great line that stuck with me, and it was, "You're only as good as you communicate." And that for me just was such a sticky and something that we should really not forget in academia, because he presented this situation where, consider yourself, you have 10 out of 10 technical skills, but you have 3 out of 10 communication skills. How do you think people perceive you? And, the answer is it'll be 3 out of 10. So you're really only as good as you can communicate. And I think sometimes people think, well, if you're focusing on the communication, that's at the cost of technical skills. But that's not, what he's saying. It's that you spend time learning your craft and honing your technical skills, but you don't stop there. You also spend time learning to communicate your value to others. And I think that's such an important lesson and something, to keep in mind with all of this. And communicating obviously isn't just, verbal. It can also be how you present yourself online. And, that's something that also I've been quite strong about. So as you know, I'm quite active on LinkedIn, and I often talk about building, a personal brand online. And for many academics, that probably sounds really icky because it's, ultimately about promoting yourself. And if, you want to see this in a way that feels maybe less icky, ultimately it's about sharing your work. It's about being discoverable. So, you have this talent and you have these skills, but who knows about it? If you don't tell anyone, then, how do you expect things to happen, to you? It's really quite a flawed logic to think, my work will speak for itself. It really won't. And, you can speak to others, who have, experienced that firsthand, but, you can also see for yourself, that the ones that are progressing, they're also allocating time to really, it's the things that maybe you also don't necessarily feel comfortable with. So communicating, giving presentations, there's an element of vulnerability with all those things that doesn't go away when you do them. But it's just like anything, it gets a bit easier with the more you do it. Having somewhere where people can see your work. So whether that's on LinkedIn, other social media, profile, whether that's having your website, it's not only, about you reaching out to people to communicate what you can do, but you also then attract people to you as well. So then you attract people with like-minded interests, or people, that can see the value. Maybe it's within a different context. So if you write, in a way that other people can also understand your work, you won't only just attract other scientists, you'll also potentially attract people that can see application of your work, maybe in terms of, commercializing your research in some way. So you may have links to startups, or maybe other companies that are working on something similar, and they can see that you maybe would add value to them. So something like LinkedIn, I think, can be very helpful, to really showcase your work. That's really what it comes down to. Just to finish on that, when it comes to applications, in academia, you will have your list of, publications, etc. But then also, if you go to industry, you'll have your 1-2 page resume. In this situation where this one person has their resume and that's it, versus the other one that has a resume, but also an active, say, LinkedIn profile, where someone can effectively binge, the content that they've been producing over the last 6 to 7 months, showing, what work they can do, their interests, what's important to them. You can just imagine, what you get to learn about that person compared to, just a 2-page resume. So for me, they are things, that you can really think of during your career journey to help you stand out.
It's pretty cool. That is that is a very interesting perspective, and I think a much needed perspective that, nowadays when you submit your application, you're going to be Googled most likely. And then if you are Googled, if there's 5 candidates and only one of them is online presenting how passionate they are about their work, and oh look, I did this interesting code, it did this, and you make a little presentation, look, it can do this, it can, it can be applied to this, and maybe you are sharing news from your field, just showing that you are consuming that kind of content and that you're passionate about it, that even if it's not something they will necessarily give you as bonus points, at least if they can explore that content, they will connect with you much more as a candidate rather than just someone who they saw their name and list of skills. I think my skill A is 3 out of 10 and my skill B is 7 out of 10. It's much more relatable. You get to actually meet the person a little bit.
Yeah,
that's one thing. When I was working with a couple of students, I started recommending this recently. I had one application for a Ph.D. That I got an invitation, among other reasons, because the professor clicked on the link in my CV. I made a little 3-minute video presenting my thesis to the broad audience. It was for a different purpose, for a 3-minute thesis competition. But in it, I was explaining, this is what we were doing. This is why it was important. This was the model that we were using. That professor had an inkling for people who know how to communicate. And he really liked the video. And he's actually, in the response to the email, said, Canon, I loved your video on, your, thesis. So I would love to have a chat with you and talk more about your thesis and your future plans. So I started recommending something like this. Maybe it would be cool to have like some way, maybe it doesn't have to be a video, but some way to demonstrate that you are actually, passionate about your work, and maybe you are explaining it, or you can demonstrate some kind of project beyond just what is in, this 1-page or 2-page list.
Yeah,
so that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Okay, we don't have too much time left. I know, Matthew, I appreciate your time. I know you're sick today, so thank you for being with me. But I don't want to take too much of that time, and I do want to leave space for another conversation one time in the future. I do want to get your brain on one more thing, which is something I'm struggling with as a, freshly starting PhD student. There are days when I feel very hyped about doing research. And I feel like I could read the whole library and do 100 experiments in a day, And then there are other days I feel like I just want to crawl in my bed and I don't want to go to the lab at all. But I know I do have to, and stuff has to get done and so on. It's been really hard for me to navigate this discrepancy between these two types of days. I don't know, is it a personal thing or other people face it as well? But I think it might be worth getting your input on this. How do you deal with your bad days when you don't feel like working? Or how did you when you were in your PhD and postdoc?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it depends what you mean by a bad day. I mean, if it's with respect to your motivation, I would say that that's totally normal. That maybe the issue is, expecting that you will always feel like that every day, because I think that's not, actually what happens. I think maybe from some of the things that we see online, we should think that way about our jobs. But I think that's just not reality, honestly. Everybody has bad days. So that is always going to happen. So don't try to think, that's not normal, and it's completely fine to do that. And those bad days can also look like sometimes you just have to write off those bad days. But I would see those bad days as also the days, that they're necessary days where they also help you look at, what progress really means. I think a lot of the time we think progress is linear, but it very rarely is. So those days, where you don't necessarily achieve everything that you set out to do, you still achieve something. They're not always, even the things that didn't work out, you take something from those, and they're all contributing to ultimately the end goal towards you getting your PhD. And so when you look at the trajectory, in terms of progress or good and bad days, across those 4 years, you'll see that, it's going all over peaks and troughs, all over the place. And that's really, what research looks like. That doesn't get, in a sense, any better the further you do it. I think what you do more with time is really learn to accept that that's really how it goes, and also to have then certain systems in place where you can be kind to yourself. So it's definitely hard to do that. I've struggled with that myself, but on those days where you're having a bad day, what can you do to help make that a bit better? Maybe you just get what you need to do done on that, and then do something nice. Maybe it's a bit of exercise or something. Just go out with your friends. Just remind yourself that your PhD isn't everything going on in your life. You have other things, and just try to zoom out a little bit, compartmentalize it. It's like the PhD is really important, but it's not everything, that's going on with me. And it just recalibrate a little bit and then come back again. That time will pass. Even the good days, they don't last forever either. And it's all just, an evolution.
That too shall pass, as the famous story goes,
Yeah,
right?
it all will. Exactly.
Matthew, there's so many things I want to ask you that I did not cross off this list. As I told you, it's impossible to cover many things I would like in 1 hour, but I hope this is a good reason for us to meet again one day. So thank you very much for being with me. Where can people find you, reach out, follow your work?
Yeah, I think the best place to find me is on LinkedIn. So Matthew Betts, PhD. I think I should pop up, so you can come find me there.
Awesome. Matthew Betts, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Kenan. This has been a lot of fun.
So I will stop